welcome to today's episode of the Balanced Approach podcast. I'm your host, Louis Padian. I hope that you're doing well and are enjoying the podcast and the topics we've covered so far. These podcasts are released every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, so be sure to subscribe wherever you are listening to be kept up to date. Today we're going to be building on the last episode where we covered some basics around dietary fat and looking at it in relation to health, weight loss, and how much do you actually need in your diet and how much I would recommend for you. So in the last episode, like I said, the basics, we covered what are dietary fats, what they actually do within the body, and are they essential for you in your diet. And we'll be building on that with a three-parter today as well around will dietary fat help or hinder your weight loss goals, as it's one of the key topics that's often covered, and there's a lot of common diets that either demonize it or put it up on a massive pedestal. We'll also be looking at how much fat you actually need to improve your health, not just in the short term, day to day, but what it's correlated with long term in regards to certain diseases like type 2 diabetes and cancer. And then also what are the best sources to get your fat from. And we'll probably touch on a really interesting concept as I go through that. But first, I think it's important to sort of go on the hot topic around weight loss. So will having fat in your diet help or hinder your weight loss? And from my experience and from what the research says, actually it won't. When we compare low carbohydrate, high fat diets with high carbohydrate, low fat diets, there's no difference in the outcomes long term, significantly anyway. What we tend to see is that if people drop carbohydrates, and this is something I touched on probably in the carbohydrates mini series as well, that people who drop carbohydrates in the first week, they might see a big drop in water weight. That might maintain as long as they keep a low carbohydrate diet, but once they start eating carbohydrates again, they'll regain that water weight with regards to replenishing their glycogen stores. We tend to see that actually it depends on the individual, so what personal preferences is, but you don't need to pick one or the other. There might be some things that you feel will be helpful in regards to food choices, but actually you don't need to pick one camp or the other. And actually a really moderate approach is something I find works for people, and having a bit more flexibility day to day can be really helpful as well. There are some things that I would consider in regards to your fat intake. So as we touched on the last episode, fat has lots of essential roles within the body in regards to helping with absorption of fat soluble vitamins, sort of your hormonal status as well. So going too low can impact that and can help with overall well-being. So, and from my experience of working with people who tend to feel better day to day, and if people, one of the things that I've commonly seen is that people go on very low, strict, low-fat diets, they might have issues with their skin qualities, their nails and their hair, and that potentially is just down to poor nutrition, but fat will play a role in that as well. And people who are in that situation usually can be a bit more stressed out about those things and not tend to make better decisions and not tend to feel that's a sustainable thing for them long term. So actually having a bit more of a moderate approach to those people, yes, there might be some things that we need to adjust and educate them around their diet, but may make you a bit happier and make it more sustainable just because you're not going to be worried about those things. One thing that we tend to see potentially with a lot of slimming groups is that they recommend overall a low fat diet, and that's because low fat foods tend to be lower in calories. So if you're taking a generally low fat approach with regards to your foods, you're probably going to be making a lot of lower calorie decisions. And if you're having more high fat foods within your diet, there is that tendency that it can push you out of that calorie deficit, which could make your diet either a lot slower or a lot longer in the long term. So that's something to consider as well with your choices around those fats. Another thing that people often miss out on as well is that if you're on a very low fat diet, one thing that we tend to see is that people tend to go low fat, high carbohydrate and make lots of swaps in regards to calorie sensitive swaps or calorie smart swaps with lots of things, with lots of sweeteners rather than sugars. And that's brilliant, to be really helpful. But you'll tend to see, or you might see, that people, or you in particular, have this craving and this insatiable appetite, I should say, that there's a bottomless pit and you're trying to get that satisfaction from your food that just isn't there, that you might not be able to get from those low fat foods because fat is missing from your diet and you're potentially craving fat within your diet. And that can tend to have people having binge episodes or overeating frequently and not really understanding why that's happening. It could just be that having days or having more moderate fat intake on the whole could be useful for you. Now, one of the things that I touched on earlier around a more interesting concept is that from my side, and when we talk about a lot of the research, we tend to talk about parts of foods or nutrients, but nutrients don't exist in day to day or wild by themselves. So it's not as if you're going to buy polyunsaturated fat off the shelf or monounsaturated fat off the shelf. You're going to buy a food that's going to have those nutrients within it, and they also come packaged up with lots of other nutrients. So we need to step away from just actually looking at these nutrients or macronutrients as a whole, as a singular, and look at the food as a whole. So I've come up with a list of sort of 3 foods that I'd probably look at reducing or removing from your diet, and then 6 foods that have been shown to be helpful. So 6 types of food to include that are going to have good or better choices for your fat intake. So the first one would be fried foods. Now, fried foods tend to be high in saturated and trans fats, and they're also correlated with increasing your LDL, which is your bad cholesterol, and decreasing your HDL, which is your good cholesterol. And they're correlated with things like heart disease and weight gain as well. So decreasing the amount of fried foods in your diet, I know it's going to sound quite a simple thing to do, but can have a huge impact for people, or just reducing it, reducing the frequency, or having a look at different ways that we are cooking those foods. So instead of deep frying, using air fryer with some fry light can dramatically save on calories, but improve the quality and nutrition of those foods. Foods that are deep fat fried or fried in general tend to have low nutrients within them, high in calories, and tend to be easier to overeat on. So a boiled potato is going to be harder to overeat than chips, for example. And just having those simple swaps within there, and this is what I work on a lot with clients, is that instead of having these fried foods, that potentially buying a frozen bag of chips to put in the oven or put in a deep fat fryer, going, right, let's make our own chips and use an air fryer potentially. And we're not saying that you can't have chips, there just might be a better way to go about it. And that's often the best way to go for people. A 2009 study found that replacing trans fats with polyunsaturated fats was associated with a 25% lower risk of coronary heart disease. So it can have a significant impact just making those simple swaps. One of the things that I used to say a lot when I run weight management groups is that we can't say by making these swaps that these things won't happen, but we can say that we can try everything we can within our moderation, within living a healthy lifestyle and balanced lifestyle, to reduce the risk of them. And if they do happen, I'd like to think that most will sit there and go, well, at least I've done some things. What we'd hate to do is have something like that happen and actually go, well, I knew about all the risk and I didn't take any action and make these simple steps, or make these easier swaps, or potentially be smarter with my food choice and activity. So that's something to consider as well. So first on the list to potentially reduce or remove or replace was fried foods. Second is processed meats. So these tend to be high in saturated and trans fats. Again, you might see a bit of a pattern with these foods. And these are things like bacon, sausage, hot dogs, and potentially going to be, again, low in nutrition, high in fat in general, potentially more high calorific, and have been associated with things like heart disease, stroke, and types of cancer as well, in particularly colorectal cancer. And that's just one of the things that trans fats especially is associated with. So I'm being smart with those choices around processed meats, going for fresh meats or meat alternatives that are potentially going to be made from mycoprotein or like corn, for example. Again, just better protein sources. So we're not saying that you can't have meat in general. Meat can be part of a really healthy diet moving forward, but just being a bit smarter with those, or potentially going for a lower fat option, can make a big difference as well. Last on the list to reduce, replace, or remove was baked goods. And this is very similar to sort of the fried elements, high in saturated fat, trans fats again. And these things include cakes, cookies, pastries, and again, low nutrition, poor, it can be associated with poor overall dietary quality. And this isn't me saying that you need to get rid of them completely. This potentially could just be something that you reduce and be more moderate with your frequency or the amount that you have. And again, making better options. So instead of buying a pack of cookies, potentially having a look at a simple, easy, healthy recipe that you can make at home, and again, gets you more involved in the eating process. And from my experience, if you're more involved with the cooking process, I should say, you're going to be more mindful in the way that you eat that food, because you'll look at all the different things that you've put in that food and try and sense them and try and taste them, and making slight adjustments to those recipes as well can be helpful. So again, a study from 2006 found that replacing trans fats with polyunsaturated fats found a low risk of type 2 diabetes. Again, those are the sort of big ones that we talk around cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, strokes, coronary heart disease, high blood pressure. Those sorts of things can easily be reduced, or the risk of those things easily be reduced by removing, reducing, or replacing those foods. So now that we know that what we should be reducing, replacing, or removing, let's have a look at things that we can move in there and increase in our diet. So first up is avocados, and these tend to get a bit of a health snobbery, and I have that myself. That is one of those things that you often see on those perfect Instagram posts, and actually can be a really enjoyable and healthy sort of option to include different meals throughout the day. They're a good source of monounsaturated fats, which can help lower your LDL, which is your bad cholesterol, and increase your HDL, which is your good cholesterol. Good source of fiber, and promote sort of with fiber when we've done an episode around that. Obviously, there's lots of health benefits, but in particular satiety and fullness from those foods. So again, more volume in your foods for less calories is going to be big win. So a 2020 study found that consuming avocado as part of a healthy diet can be associated with a reduced risk of heart disease, metabolic syndrome, and types of cancer. And metabolic syndrome is a really interesting condition that's more modern. And in particular, I've worked on it in the NHS throughout delivering projects around. And it's sort of a combination of lots of factors coming together to create this perfect storm of ill health and disease. So I'll do an episode on that in the future if that's something you haven't heard of, but it's just a combination of different common conditions coming together to really, really amplify the ill health effects of some of those conditions. So first up, avocados. Next, nuts and seeds. Again, this is one of the better ones because it's sort of easy and ready to go. It can be a really good snack on the go to have, just something to tide you over. So again, high in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, and packed with omega-3 and omega-6, which is brilliant for heart health, anti-inflammatory and heart protective benefits. And they're a good source of potentially protein, fiber, vitamins and minerals as well. So complete sort of food there, food groups and combinations of them as well. And just adding them to meals can add a lot of diversity to the taste, texture and flavour of those foods as well. And when we look at the studies, a 2014 meta-analysis found that consuming nuts and seeds associated with a reduced risk of coronary heart disease, stroke and type 2 diabetes. And you've probably seen a trend here across all these foods that if it's high in trans fats and saturated fats, then you've got an increased risk potentially of cholesterol, or particularly LDL cholesterol, and maybe a reduction in your HDL, and an increased risk in type 2 diabetes, stroke, and coronary heart disease. And if it's high in the unsaturated fats, then it's the reverse effects of that as well. Just making those simple swaps or looking at ways to reduce them and increase them can be a really, really positive step forward. Next on the list, and this will be touched on in the next episode as well, but it's fatty fish or oily fish that we might call them, high in omega-3s. And there's lots of health benefits associated with that, which I won't go into too much detail now, as we've got a whole episode covering them a bit more in depth. But mainly around salmon, tuna, mackerel, sardines, great sources of omega-3 fatty acids, great for heart health in general, and have been associated with lower risk of heart attack and stroke just from 1 to 2 servings per week. So that's the sort of recommendations around the government. And again, when we talk around fish oil supplements on the next episode, that'll be something that we'll touch on as well. Next on the list, olive oil, and this is a big feature within the Mediterranean diet, and it's high in monounsaturated fats and could be a great one to just swap in for your cooking if possible. And it's known for the Mediterranean diet is probably one of the healthiest diets worldwide that we can see. People tend to live higher or much longer in those regions, but also tend to have a better quality of life as well. And there's some research around blue zones that we might do an episode on as well, because it's quite an interesting concept across the world, different sort of trends and traits that might help with people living healthier, happier, longer lives. But again, reduced inflammation across the body and improved heart health. And CBD is the biggest killer across the world. It's one of the things that often I see working in the NHS and working with individuals has impacted everyone, whether themselves or someone else that's close to them. And just making these simple, again, not easy changes can have a significant impact if we start now, giving ourselves the best chance long term with regards to heart health. And a 2018 study found that replacing saturated fats with olive oil was associated with low risk of cardiovascular events, which is kind of expected, but again, doesn't take away from the impact of it being a really impactful change. Just swapping in olive oil instead of other oils, reducing that oil intake as well with weight. Again, there's lots of different factors that might have a ripple effect, improving overall health and well-being. Penultimate one on the list is dark chocolate, which is one that's often overplayed, but I think could be a really useful one to include in moderation. And it wouldn't be one of the things saying that you can't have milk chocolate and you should only have dark chocolate. I think there's a place for just food enjoyment in there as well, that people just being happier and having the thing that they actually want, just in moderation, and then including these aspects in throughout the days, weeks, months that can really have these small but constant potential positive impacts long term. So high in polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats again, and anything with 70% or higher content has been sort of listed in that dark chocolate for health benefits, high in antioxidants as well. And it's just one of those ones that can really take the edge off for people. If people are wanting that chocolatey taste, they might tend to have a whole bar of dairy milk, for example. If we go, right, actually, if you just make this little swap in here, and it tends to come in smaller bars as well, which can help with more mindful approaches to these snacks, it can really tick that box a lot easier and a lot less calories, and allow people to have that little chocolatey kick without going over and feeling guilty around it as well. A 2014 study found that consuming dark chocolate was associated with a low risk of heart disease and stroke. Again, just a little one saying that actually this might be a better option for me. It doesn't have to be all the time. It should be sometime or most of the time, could be a step in the right direction. Last but not least, and this one was a controversial one, as there's a lot of conflicting research, probably one of the biggest researched food groups out there, and that was milk and dairy. And I'm a big advocate for milk and dairy. I'm not funded or anything like that, but it's a great food to include in your diet. But again, it's a bit grey on the health outcomes potentially in some areas. And there's a big, vast array of, well, full fat milk versus fat free milk, very different foods, but come in the same bracket. So when we have a look at milk in particular, or dairy as a group, mostly saturated fats within whole milk, so it's a 60-40 split in favour of saturated fats, with fat-free going from down to 1585, so more in favour of the unsaturated fats. Also less calories as well, and something that we'll touch on around weight loss can be often overplayed is actually all this stuff's really good and interesting around fat, but actually managing weight is probably going to have a lot more better impact, be more physically active, a lot bigger impact in comparison to what fats you're having within your diet, because we know the health impacts of being overweight or being inactive long term are going to be huge compared to potentially making these small changes here, but doesn't mean that we can't do them as well. So as I've said, it's not just the fat content of milk, but actually it's a great source of protein. Calcium is the best source of calcium, really good source of vitamin D as well. Vitamins and minerals such as B12 and potassium, which are all going to be beneficial, especially if we can make better choices around dairy. So milk and dairy intake is correlated with reduced osteoporosis and better bone health, which is no surprise, especially with the calcium content, reduced cardiovascular events, lower risk of obesity and being overweight. So that effect was actually more pronounced with the lower fat intake as well. So that's something to consider, that potentially going for a low fat option could be better in regards to just making that simple swap with your milks, with your cheeses, for example. Just go for a low fat option could make a big difference in regards to how successful you will weight, which again will improve cardiovascular health long term. And there's no association between dairy intake and increased risk of cardiovascular events, according to a meta-analysis from 2020. So overall, I know I've spoken a lot about a lot of things there, but to put it into a nutshell, I'd say predominantly get your fat from unsaturated sources. Predominantly have whole unprocessed foods. That's what we tend to see within the trends. So again, when we spoke about the first few groups, they're more processed within those three around that processed meat. Within that fried foods and baked foods, they're all processed. When I spoke about this six following that, a lot of those were less processed or completely unprocessed foods, whole foods. So that's the sort of trend that we're looking for with regards to our fat sources. And then we know that milk and dairy has some saturated fat in there, but is associated with better health outcomes and better weight management as well. So if I'm not going to say completely cut out saturated fat, actually having some saturated fat from dairy could be health beneficial as well. And they're associated with reduced risk of chronic disease, heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes, which are all things that we're trying to avoid. Reducing most of your saturated fat sources within your diet is probably going to be a good thing and be health promoting long term. So now that we've covered some sources that you should have and whether it's going to help with weight, actually, how much fat do you need for health? So with health and weight loss, they're quite intertwined from my books. A lot of people that I work with want to get healthier and want to lose weight. It's sort of the common goals that they have. And when setting people's fat intake, it's probably my last consideration, because usually we'll set the calories, we'll set the protein, carbohydrates within a certain range, depending on if they've got performance goals or anything like that, making sure they've got maybe potentially a fiber goal as well, or 5 a day goal, and then making up the remainder of those calories with fat. So fat can range from 25%, but I tend to have a minimum standard, and I'll talk about that in a second. So when we talk about, as I've said, the changes that we can make to fat choices, actually the amount of change that, or health benefits that we can get from managing our weight a bit better could massively outweigh just making all changes to our dietary fat. So that's something to consider as well. If you're going, well, I need to know what type of fat I can have, I sort of already told you that. But if you're feeling that you might need to lose some weight, or you're feeling that your weight might be having a negative impact on your health, that might be a more important thing to focus on at the moment. And that could be something that you don't want to hear right now, but that's what the research suggests, and that's what my experience says working with people, that the biggest effect that we have, like losing, if you're overweight or obese, losing a kilo can have a 16 to 17% reduction in type 2 diabetes risks. And that's a massive impact just from losing 1 kilo. So losing that 5 to 10% can have huge health benefits, and that's the sort of range that might work for people. So when we come to setting people's dietary fat guidelines, or how much fat you should have in your diet, the lower end tends to be 20 to 25%. Anything below that, people tend to have health problems with regards to sex hormones sort of dropping off. You might find that people are really craving that, but even on most low fat diets, people tend to be around that 25% mark anyway, even if they're eating a low fat diet. So not too much to worry about. But if you're tracking your calories and you're noticing you're going super low fat and you're fearful of fats, then potentially that's something worth addressing long term. So in summary, will fat help or hinder you losing weight? Not at all. It could be really beneficial to help in managing your food and eating habits by having some more in there. I tend to find a more moderate approach to fat can be beneficial for a lot of people. You don't have to go one camp or the other, but choosing lower fat options when you're potentially having a look at your milk and dairy options could be a better option, managing your calories a bit better, and going really high with your fat actually might not mean a huge amount of food, but again, it's down to your individual preference and goals. If you're training a lot of high intensity stuff, I'd probably suggest having some more carbohydrates in there and not focusing so much on fat. I'd probably suggest ketogenic diets probably aren't going to suit the vast majority of people long term if they want to have a healthy and balanced lifestyle, but that's completely up to them. How much fat do you need in your diet for health? A minimum of sort of 20%, 25% from my opinion. You can go higher, but again, if we're going super high, then we might need to be more mindful of the calories within that and the types of fat within that, the food choices we're making. Where are the best sources to get your fat? So predominantly unsaturated sources, whole unprocessed foods if you can, including things like milk and dairy in moderation, or making better choices around sort of the fat content of those as well. And try reducing, replacing, or removing baked foods, processed foods, and fried foods if you can, and increasing avocados, nuts and seeds, oily fish, olive oil, dark chocolate, and milk and dairy. So there you have it. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode of the Balanced Approach podcast. If you have any questions, queries, or would like to reach out to me, please do. I am at Louis Padian Nutrition, which is at LOUISPADIAN Nutrition on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all other social media platforms. If you're looking for support in achieving your goals and living a healthier, happier, and more balanced life in the process, click the link below and inquire about working with me. Remember to subscribe to the Balanced Approach podcast wherever you're listening for more insightful episodes, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.